Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new, welcome. My name is Jennifer, and this is Mystery Monday. So this week's Mystery Monday takes place in my hometown, another hometown story. I am going to tell you this story partly by memory and partly by facts that I found on the internet. Most of the facts that I'm going to tell you I had to look up because I didn't know the exact dates, but I've heard this story for many years, and this has been a legend in my town since probably the 50s or before. This is the legend of Roney's Point. Roney's Point is located in the county, and that is in Ohio County. That is the county that Wheeling is located in. This part of Wheeling, part of the county, is in the rural area. It is mostly woods. There are not many homes, and back when this story did take place, there were no homes there. The legend of Roney's Point begins in the early 1900s. Henry Schmulbach, who was a German immigrant, moved to West Virginia in 1852 when he was 10 years old. He located here with his parents, and through the years he worked numerous jobs on the river, working his way up, becoming an entrepreneur, and finally, when he became an adult, he started his own business. He took over the family business that was in the business of wholesale alcohol. By the early 1900s, Henry was a multimillionaire. He was not only successful in the stock markets, he was a gambler. He enjoyed horse racing. He traveled the tri-state area betting on horses. He even owned some of his own horses. In the late 1800s, Henry became the president and chief stockholder of the Nail City Brewing Company. And the Nail City Brewing Company is still around today. It's been through quite a few hands, ownership, but it is still in operation today, and they still brew their own blends of beer. So in the early 1900s, Henry decided to buy a parcel of land in rural Wheeling, Roney's Point to be exact. He bought 490 acres, and he commissioned someone to build a mansion for him. Henry was single, never married, and no children. But his plans was to give the mansion to his sisters to live in, as well as himself. But unfortunately, before the mansion could be completed in 1913, his sisters both passed away. Even though Henry was a successful businessman, he had a little bit of a shady background. He was tried for murder after he attacked a man who stole his horse and buggy outside of a bar. He was later acquitted of that, but he still really didn't mix in very well with the elite in Wheeling. At that time, Wheeling had a lot of well-to-do members of society, and he just did not mix well with them. So in 1913, after the passing of his sisters, and after the completion of his mansion, he decided to sell off a lot of his stock holdings and his business ventures, and he moved into the mansion himself. The mansion was on 490 acres, and there were 17 structures on the property. Those structures included the 20-plus room mansion, a greenhouse, a dairy barn, an ice house, a greenhouse, a water fountain, and a carriage house, among others. Henry was known to host lavish parties. Sometimes the parties would last days or even weeks. He would invite people to stay at his mansion, and he hired a staff to care for those guests in his home, complete with hostesses, waitresses, and caterers. There was alcohol, bootlegged of course, gambling, and some shady activity with some unpopular ladies of the night, we'll call them. Henry quickly became lonely living in the mansion all by himself. So he actually married one of the hostesses that he employed for his parties. Her name was Pauline. Henry was 69 and Pauline was 48. Unfortunately, Henry died 2 years later in 1915. Pauline had no interest in staying in the mansion or keeping the grounds for herself, so she sold the property to the Ohio County Commission for $125,000. It was then that the Ohio County Commission turned the property into a poor farm. In those days, a poor farm was where people that was unemployed or homeless would go. They did not receive compensation for their work, but they were allowed to live on the property, and they had community gardens, and they took care of the grounds in exchange for a place to live. In the late 1930s, the tuberculosis plague started spreading across the United States. It hit West Virginia especially hard. The Ohio County Commission closed the poor farm and constructed an infirmary. This was a 2-story hospital that consisted of 40 beds, and it opened in 1936. In those days, there was not much known about tuberculosis, other than when you contracted it, you were going to die of it. And nobody knew how to care for these people, and to try to contain the spread of the disease, people were quarantined to an area and left to die. From the time the infirmary opened in 1936 until the plague started dying down in the late 1940s, hundreds of people passed through the doors. Hundreds of sick people, dying people. After the tuberculosis plague had been eradicated and there was no more need for the infirmary, the Ohio County Commission then turned the infirmary into a mental hospital. This hospital housed not only the mentally ill, but those who suffered from addiction. In those days, there was not a lot known about mental illness and addiction. They believed that people with addictions were just crazy, and they were ostracized from the general population. Once they were sent to this mental hospital, they were treated with experimental procedures, everything from electric shock therapy to lobotomies. The patients either got better or they died. Most of them died. During the years of its operation, the mental hospital, which was dubbed the Insane Asylum, came under heavy scrutiny. There were numerous reports of very barbaric conditions at the hospital. Everything from sexual assault to patients trying to escape because of the barbaric conditions. People were seen running from the hospital trying to escape, missing limbs, missing eyes, bloody and battered, and beyond anything recognizable as a human being. So many deaths occurred at this hospital that they were forced to open their own cemetery. In fact, they opened a chute and made an underground tunnel. They placed the body in the chute at the top of the hill at the hospital and slid it clear to the bottom of the hill where the cemetery was located, so no one would know exactly how many people were dying and to keep it out of the eye of the public. After years of scrutiny and people complaining about the conditions at the hospital, it finally closed in 1972. The state of West Virginia then turned the property back over to the Ohio County Commission, who closed the facility because the structures were in such deplorable conditions. When the county closed the asylum, everything inside was left behind, from medical supplies to patients' records to all the furnishings. Left behind in the basement were rows and rows of cages that were used to hold the worst of the worst and the criminally insane. In another room, there was found a steel bar that ran across the top and the bottom of the room. Shackles were found at the top and the bottom. People were shackled standing along this bar, and it was said that they were shackled there for days at a time, standing. Another room was full of straitjackets and other restraints. Over the years, these items were all stolen by local people, people coming to experience the hauntings and the goings-on of the property. After the closing, the grounds became a very popular hangout for high school students. They would have parties and go there to hang out. And that is what led to, what people believe, led to a fire in 1975 that destroyed the mansion. It burned to the ground, and the only thing left standing was a shell of the house. And I'll insert some pictures here. Over the years, many of the high school students and people who would go to the grounds to party would report a lot of mysterious things taking place. They would see orbs of light, hear people screaming with no one around, and just feeling a very eerie presence on the property. In 1986, Cecil Tominac was laid off from the mines. His father, John, was a High County commissioner, and he gave Cecil the job of being the caretaker of the property. He was allowed to move his family into the nurse's residence on the property. He was not paid for this position, but he was allowed to live in the house for free. Cecil, his wife, and 3 children moved into the nurse's residence. It was a 6-bedroom, 5-bathroom structure. From the day they moved in, they started experiencing eerie things. One of the best-known legends of Roney's Point is the Gray Man. The Gray Man has been seen by dozens and dozens of people that have visited the property over the years. The Gray Man is dressed all in gray. He has gray see-through eyes and carries a shotgun. He is said to roam the property, guarding something, and no one knows quite what. One account of the Gray Man was from a man who was hiking on the land. He said he saw the Gray Man from behind and didn't realize he wasn't real. He called out to him and said hello. The Gray Man turned around and saw him and pulled the gun on him. The man panicked and started to run. But before he could get to the bottom of the hill off of the property, the Gray Man appeared in front of him, with a gun pointed right at him. The sound of an approaching car startled them. When the man looked away and then looked back towards the Gray Man, he had disappeared. There were no trees in the area, so he wasn't hiding behind anything. He just disappeared into thin air. There are many accounts of lights being seen at night in the asylum, even though there was no electricity working inside the asylum. Howling and banging noises coming from inside. There have been many accounts of a woman who is seen running from the asylum down the hill. One witness's story says that when he encountered the woman, she was bloody and her fists were clenched. When he approached her, she stopped and had a horrified look on her face. When she unclenched her hand, a bloody eyeball fell out. The man reached in his pocket to get his cell phone to call for help. As he began dialing 911, she moved through him and continued down the hill. He didn't see her after that. In yet another story from the Roney's Point Asylum property, a man had been hired to board up the entrances of all the buildings because of all the partying that was taking place. The High County Commission didn't want to take a chance of someone being injured on the property and then being sued, so all the doors and windows were boarded up. The man finished the boarding up of one of the structures and left for the day. The next day when he came back, all the boards were pulled off of the building. He immediately thought that it was the work of some teenagers pulling a prank on him, so he reboarded up the windows. As he went around back to continue boarding up the doors in the back, he felt a cold breeze all around him. This was the middle of summer, and there was no wind blowing. He thought it was odd, but he didn't pay much mind to it and went back to work. As he was laying the board over the glass pane of the door, he noticed a shadow from inside. He was a little aggravated now because he was having to do this for the second time, and now he thought somebody might be inside. So he was going to have to take all the boards off of the door, go inside, and get the person out before he finished his work. Once inside the structure, he heard footsteps coming from upstairs. He went up the stairs to find out who was up there. He started calling out to whoever was inside, asking them to come out, telling them that they needed to get out of the house because he was boarding it up. There was no answer. As he got closer to the end of the hall, he heard mumbling and voices coming from inside the room. The door was shut. He stood still outside the door for a couple minutes listening. He could hear a woman's voice mumbling, and he could hear a man's voice that had an evil laugh, but he couldn't make out what he was saying. He turned the knob, but the door wouldn't open. He shook the doorknob, and it wouldn't open. Finally, he put his shoulder into the door and bust the door down. Inside the room, he saw a man standing over a woman on a table. It was an examination table. The woman was strapped to the table, and the man was performing some type of surgery on her brain while she was awake. She was crying and mumbling, but her words weren't audible. When the man in the white coat looked up and saw the man standing there, he had an evil look on his face. He laughed. The man who was working on the house was scared and turned and ran. He called the police, and the sheriff's department responded. When the sheriff's department arrived, they went into the building with their guns drawn. They approached the door at the end of the hall and went into the room, but there was nothing there. There was no blood, there was no man, and there was no woman, and there was no signs that anybody had been there. To this day, he swears he saw somebody there. The sheriff's department agrees that he probably did because they have had many reports of a man in a white coat on the property. The property is still owned today by the Ohio County Commission. Over the years, there has been a lot of talk on what to do with the property, from development to turning it into a housing development. But there is no plans as of now to do anything with the property. Most of the structures have been all reduced to rubble, and what still is left standing is too dangerous to go inside, although some people do continue to go in to investigate. A lot of people do EVPs and do ghost hunts on the property. Some people claim this is all a legend and not true, while others claim that this is absolutely true and it did take place. So we're going to end this story with some pictures from the property, as well as a couple video clips of people talking about the property. I hope you enjoyed this spooky story for Monday, and we'll do it again next Monday. Bye, everyone.